Hey, this is Pastor Tim Delaney coming to you once more as we make our way through the different books of the Bible. Today we've jumped right into our next book, that is Ruth, that follows after Judges. Now, Ruth is one of those fascinating little books that we're going to see a little bit different because, as small as this book is, in only 4 chapters, there's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot going on there. And so, if we truly wanted to, we pretty much would be dedicating one of these episodes, one per chapter, if we really wanted to get into the nitty gritty of things. But that's not what this is for. This is more or less Bible in a nutshell. This is what we're looking at as each little step. And so, of course, what we're going to do is take off into our first step as we look at the authorship. Because one of the things that is really fascinating with the book of Ruth is that we literally have no idea who is the author of this book. We don't know very much on that part. As far as the text is, it's anonymous and does not identify its writer. But there is, of course, Jewish tradition that stems from the Talmud, which, as we've talked before, is one of those important writings and book setups of the Old Testament, especially with Jewish or scholarship. And it attributes the authorship to the prophet Samuel. Many modern scholars consider it likely written in the post-exilic period. So, we pretty much have three different perspectives that we're looking here at this. Of course, there's the traditional view that stems from the Talmud, which it focuses towards the prophet Samuel, who is traditionally believed to have written the books of Judges, Samuel, and Ruth. And so we would see a large part of this that plays out because, especially as we would see at the end of Judges, we actually see kind of like that foreshadow and play out of what we see with Samuel. So there's this commonality that we see here with all of this. A second, of course, is we're looking at that modern scholarship in which this is seen just like this is one of those viewpoints that we've seen so far through all of our books of the Bible, that this was not truly written down or done in scholarship until much later. And in particular, we're looking at the post exilic, so we're looking around the 5th century BCE. So, of course, this is before the Common Era, this is before Christ, and we have those 400 years of silence that comes from not seeing any prophets. So, we're seeing this large gap that we potentially see that this is believed to be in. And then, of course, there is the alternative theories, and this is one that I did not, or was a little shocked to see because these were not ones that I had actually seen of this one. But some scholars suggest the book could have been written by a woman due to its specific focus on women's experiences, or that is written to defend King David's lineage. Because remember, Ruth, when she marries Boaz and they have a child, this is the grandfather of David. So we're seeing this direct lineage here. But also one of the fascinating things is that this would actually make sense if this was written during that time, because as in the theological world, we have what are called codexes. These are collections of readings and scholarly papers that are dated from years and years and years ago, in which this one in particular is called Codex W, that can be found in museums. It does go on rotations that you can see these. I highly recommend. The last that I know is that it is in Washington, D.C. at the museum there, but it does make tracks around. But the big part of what Codex W tells us is that gives us the notion that the first how many books of the Bible were for the first time written down onto paper or papyrus at this time would have been a woman during the reign of King David. So a woman that was in there that had the ability to write, that could do all this stuff, was the first to put this to paper then. But it's one of those really fascinating things I highly recommend. So even if you did like a quick Google search of Codex W, it's so well worth checking into these things. So, but one of the important things that also gives us is some of the contextual clues to what's going on during this time. And so the time period is that the story takes place during the era of the Judges, but the genealogy concluding with King David suggests that it's composed during or after David's reign, likely to legitimize his royal line. But what we're seeing in the context is that this is happening at some point during the time of Judges then. And so a big part that gives us this contextual clues to the authorship setup is the purpose is that the book highlights themes of kindness, or hesed, and loyalty, arguing a more inclusive view of faithful foreigners. I mean, in this particular, we're looking at the Moabites, which do not have a good go around with, especially with the people of Israel, with that. Especially if you consider the fact that, remember, when they were crossing over from Egypt, the Moabites, they had a great war on the plains of the Moabites, and so this plays a really interesting homage to the inclusiveness that we see with God's relationship and faith to things. So, in a large scope, so that leads us into our genres that we were looking at throughout this time. The Book of Ruth is predominantly a Hebrew historical short story or a novella, or it can also be seen as a pastoral romance, offering a narrative contrast to the violent era of Judges. Because one of the fascinating things is that we see this time of violence and hate and people uprising and fighting with bloodshed and everything through Book of Judges, and then you come over to Ruth, where there of course is the undertones of a genocide of the Jewish people, but it's not solved through violence meet violence. It's not might versus might, but we actually see a diplomatic or even a very charismatic way of going about this. And so you see this great contrast between the two setups. And so this also gets seen as kind of like in the genre of redemption, or a story of redemption, as we see a story of everyday life, or what is also called idyll, the demonstration of God's providence. So when that comes down to the actual genres themselves, so like we said, a pastoral romance, an idyll, set in the countryside during the harvest, that follows a romantic, hopeful plot, sometimes characterized as an idyll due to the peaceful rural setting amidst tumultuous times. And so what we're seeing there is it just feels like a book you pick up off the shelf. And what makes it so personal is it's a very everyday life thing. We see them struggle, we see them go through hardships. I mean, it becomes a very relatable novella, short story, of what most of us can probably like, yeah, you know what, I've been there before. And so that actually takes us into that historical novella or short story. It is highly artistic, brief narrative that develops a plot throughout clear scenes, and it focuses on character and dialogue. It's a really heavy focus, not just coming from like this third person perspective, but also this very one-on-one first person, just as I said, as you're reading a book itself. And that's where we also find our theological wisdom and narrative, in which it illustrates a divine providence, faithfulness, and inclusiveness of foreigners like Ruth the Moabite into God's covenant. Because that's one of the things that we tend to overlook greatly, is that when we look at the lineage David or of Jesus, we constantly keep this focus. Okay, Jewish people, Jewish focus, Jewish leadership, but we forget that Jesus has 5 women in his genealogy, and most of them are not even Jews themselves. One, of course, we have Ruth the Moabite. We have one who was a prostitute. We have one who was who betrayed her people to help the Israelites. I mean, we have this whole inclusiveness that we tend to overlook and foreshadow, but yeah, it's very much part of Jesus' lineage and part of our rooted in our faith itself. So then, of course, we have the prose narrative with poetry. We see a lot of poetry. Well, mostly prose. The author shifts into poetic verses at key moments. So, especially when we look at the section where Ruth is going before her husband, or not before her husband, but Ruth is going. I'm thinking Esther for a moment there, but Ruth is speaking to her mother-in-law, speaking to actually Boaz, and speaks in such an elegant way of of talking to them. And so we then, of course, have this whole thing with the whole family history. We see a genealogical viewpoint and narrative on here, in which there's that focus around the genealogy of King David. Then, of course, the one that I added this one. This one is not commonly seen on these lists for genres, but in my opinion, I believe this is also very parable-like. The story encourages us not to see not just that we ought to be like Ruth, but we are like Naomi. And what we see in our parable of this is, granted, the major story of Ruth is in this, but it also gives us this deeply amazing position, our Naomi, because where we ought to act like Ruth, we should see ourselves in her. Very much, I'm sure we see ourselves in Naomi, who is this longly dedicated woman who is strong in her faith, who is dedicated to her children, who is dedicated to her people, and holds on to that in such a passionate way. I mean, that's very similar to the way that we are supposed to be and see our own faith, in which we are so passionately dedicated to it that we go with that thing. And so we very much see this Naomi along with being like Ruth in this. So what we then see next with all this is what our main themes are. And so the book of Ruth is a narrative. I mean, that's just straight up what it is. It's a narrative of God's providence, redemption, and faithful love, or what is also known as Hesed. We see it transforming tragedy into a blessing from the time of the judges, and its primary purpose is to show how a foreign woman, Ruth, is included in Israel for her loyalty, highlighting God's grace and to provide the ancestry of King David. So what we see as our main themes here is, of course, redemption. We see the Hesed, providence of daily life, and the inclusion of Gentiles. But we're going to look at each of those a little bit, in which we see the redemption part. This is not just any type of redemption, but is also referred to as kinsman redemptor. So this is where we see that focus with Boaz acts as the kinsman redeemer, a close relative who buys back the land and marries Ruth, rescuing the family from poverty and childlessness. Because one of the things that we have to remember in this is that Naomi, who met her husband, they left, they traveled far away, they had 2 sons. These 2 sons marry Naomi, or they marry Ruth, and of course I'm drawing a quick blank on her sister-in-law's name, which that would be Orpah. It's Orpah. And so what we see with these 2 is then the husband dies, the 2 sons die, and so they make their way back to their homeland. Well, the problem with the law and tradition of these times is the fact that women can't own the property in this way, so it has to go to next of kin. And the only kin that they have in the area that can do this is Boaz, who's a distant relative. And so it falls upon him to take this on and do this thing. So then, of course, our other theme is Hesed, or what is known as steadfast love, loyalty. This is a Hebrew term describing the intense, loyal kindness Ruth shows her mother-in-law Naomi, and that Boaz shows them both. It's very much what we see, very similarly to the way that we understand the Greeks have 4 words for the word love. In fact, if you have a chance to read, you'd think I'd have this stuff when I do this. Here we go. I highly recommend checking out this book that does address this stuff. It is The 4 Loves by C.S. Lewis. I strongly recommend the book, in which we understand that there are 4 types of love that are out there, and that these are amazing steps. So, of course, we have Stoge, which is the kind of love that is friendship. Stoge is that type of love that is friendship or affection in that part. Then we have Philia, which is your like camaraderie, friendship setup. Eros, which has to do with that romantic love, and then of course the perfect love, God's love, which agape. I can't believe I was trying to blank on that, but agape. And so we see that there is this dedication, faith, and hope that lays, especially in that what we consider agape love. So I rather recommend that book, but that gets us off topic a little bit. But so we look at that next one that focuses around providence in daily life. And so we see God is rarely described as intervening dramatically, but rather is shown working through the mundane. I mean, oftentimes the most effective ways is not the grand scheme, but just the little things, the mundane daily actions that we see play out this. And that's one of the things that makes Ruth probably one of the most relatable books for us when it comes to the Old Testament, is because we don't see these grand gestures. We don't see these over-the-top things. We just see Ruth going through everyday life, interacting with people, and growing and seeing from there. And that's what makes it so meaningful for us, and understand that even the little things we do can make all the difference in the world. And so, of course, that inclusion with Gentiles, as a Moabite, Ruth's inclusion is a faithful member of God's covenant because it highlights what that all plays out. I mean, when you go back and look at Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, we see these laws, we see these sayings, we see these things going on about how they have to maintain this separation. They're the chosen people, but yet we have this Moabite woman who goes against everything of this, being welcomed, and not just being welcomed into the frozen chosen, you could almost say, but the chosen people of God, but is very much integral to the line of Jesus in being the Messiah in Christ. So we see this inclusiveness that goes beyond what we could even understand. So then when we look at the purpose of things, we see that the book of that we see that it follows showing God's hand in crisis, providing genealogy, an example of faithfulness. And what we see in all this is that, of course, that showing God's hand in crisis is it illustrates that even during times of despair and loss, God is in control and working toward a positive outcome. As we'll see with the fact that Naomi goes through some great tragedies, but yet we see God's blessing, God's work through Ruth, who refuses to leave her side in all of this and be with her and walk with her. We see providing genealogy, so it's the big genealogy that highlights the story that leads directly to David then. And so it grounds his genealogy in a narrative of devotion. And of course that last one that says an example of faithfulness, it offers a contrast to the disobedience. It shows that contrast to what was going on in the time of the judges to a more peaceful, almost tranquil time of what it comes throughout all of this. So what does that mean overall with the context of what was going on? So as we remember that the book of Ruth is a narrative. That's what it's going down to. So what the context shows is that the background is that Ruth was from Moab, a neighboring nation, often in conflict with Israel, and she was a religious outsider. Loyalty and commitment, we see this witnessed with the context that following the death of her husband, Mahlon, Ruth refused to abandon her mother-in-law Naomi, who was returning to Bethlehem from Moab. Her declaration is, "Your people shall be my people, and your God is my God." It's a cornerstone to our entire faith of what we see play out here. One of the other big contexts of what's important going on here is the gleaning in the field. Upon returning to Bethlehem, Ruth supported herself and Naomi by gleaning leftovers in a field belonging to a wealthy man named Boaz. One of the things that is deeply overlooked that was crucial to the hospitality laws and moral code of the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, was that when you had a field, you of course did it because you needed to provide for you and your family, but you left a section of it for those who were struggling, those who were alien, those who were foreigners, those who were on hard times, that they could go there and take some to be able to survive and continue going. It's a hospitality thing. It's a common courtesy. It's a moral and ethical code to care for your neighbor. Remember, love your neighbor as yourself. But then, of course, we have the one that we've been seeing with the kinsman redeemer, Boaz acting as a kinsman redeemer, a relative responsible for restoring a family's livelihood and land. Because remember, Naomi and her family, they left. In order for them to come back and claim the land that they once were on and everything, they need kinsmen. Normally this would be done by the husband or any male heirs that you have. They're gone. So that meant that Naomi is kind of out of luck. But that's where Boaz comes in and is able to ensure this safety and welcome us in. And of course, what we see with the legacy that we see with the context, we'll see that with the genealogy where, of course, Ruth and Boaz had a son named Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of King David. This places Ruth a foreigner once more in the genealogy of Jesus, and as we consider and think about that, we see that with our summary of that the story is widely regarded for highlighting themes of loyalty, kindness, and God's providence, and it is a central text to the Jewish festival of Shavuot. We're not going to get into the details on that one, because remember, this is all just in a nutshell with stuff. So what we see then with our major sections, so this is our narrative, and normally what I have is that there's the major sections, and then I follow up with a narrative flow. But with the whole context of what this book is as a narrative, they kind of overlay each other. So I have it differently today versus other times with how we look at the major sections of the narrative flow. And so as a book goes, you of course have your chapters, we have your focuses and where they go. And so the way we're going to look at this is that we have Act 1. So we're looking at 4 acts. Act 1, Chapter 1. And this is the descent into emptiness. This first chapter focuses on Naomi losing her husband, her sons in Moab. She returns to Bethlehem with a devoted Ruth, are changing her name to Mara, which means bitter, to reflect her loss. And so we see this transition happen there. Act 2, which then becomes chapter 2, is that hope of provision. Ruth gathering grain to support them happens upon the field of Boaz, a wealthy relative. Boaz acts with kindness, ensuring their protection and nourishment, revealing her role in a potential kinsman redeemer. And so now we go over to Act 3, Chapter 3, in which this is the risk of redemption. So this is, as books or movies go, you have to have your what's going on? And then, of course, that risk of redemption, you are going up to hit that climatic moment in the story, in which this is Chapter 3, in which we see Naomi advises Ruth to visit Boaz at the threshing floor, where Ruth asks him to marry her, aligning with the custom of kinsman redeemer. Boaz accepts, praising her character and promising action. And then, of course, everything has been built up. Okay, we have our happy ending then. So, Chapter 4, Act 4, with the restoration of joy. Boaz legally redeems the land and marries Ruth, turning our Naomi's bitterness into joy. The book ends with the birth of a son, Obed, who becomes the grandfather of King David, highlighting God's providence and creating a royal lineage out of tragedy. So what does that mean for our thematic approach? Our theme approach that we go at this is it highlights specific themes. It steps away from the whole understanding of the story narrative, but looks at it from another perspective of what do we see the transition and goal of themes that play throughout it. So of course we see the redemption and kinsman redeemer, Goel. And so Boaz, of course, helps restore the honor and the sanctity for that family. Hesed, which is the covenant loyalty and kindness that plays throughout this. The story is defined by selfless love and loyalty displayed by Ruth to Naomi. And then Boaz to the two women, fulfilling God's law through love. And so we see that in a more amazing sense. God's sovereign providence, because God's hand is not shown through miracles, but through the accidental orchestration of events. So, like Ruth finding Boaz's field to turn bitterness into joy. And so while we don't see God directly are into this in the same way, we see that it's the whole saying where you may not be able to physically see God, but you can see God's works at hand. Then, of course, that falls into the inclusion of foreigner and Gentiles. As a Moabite, that is one of the cardinal themes, because Israel has been constant problems with the Moabites. And with the Moabites, we see this inclusion into something more. That God is not just the God of Israel, but the God of the world, the God of the known world. And so we see this on a much grander scale of things. And then, of course, resurrection and reversal. It's not resurrection in the sense that we think of Jesus coming back from the dead, but we see a resurrection of new life and hope for these people here. So the story is a powerful narrative of faithfulness that connects the brokenness of the time of Judges to the hope of the Messianic kingdom then. So then what we see is we play out our major characters throughout all of this. And what we see with our characters is that there are 3 main characters: Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. Ruth is a Moabite who, after her husband's death, shows extreme loyalty to her mother-in-law, leaving her homeland to follow God and Naomi to Bethlehem, known for her courage, hard work as a gleaner, and her virtue. We have Naomi, who is the dedicated mother-in-law of Ruth, who returns to Bethlehem from Moab empty and broken after losing her husband Elimelech and their 2 sons. She is a shrewd mentor to Ruth. She's not exactly the most happy-go-lucky one, guiding her towards security through Boaz. And then, of course, we have Boaz, a wealthy, honorable farmer in Bethlehem, and a relative of Naomi's deceased husband, and it is him as the Goel, the kinsman redeemer. He marries Ruth, fulfilling his duty to protect his family line. So then we, of course, come across the supportive characters. Obed, which is the son of Ruth and Boaz, grandfather of King David. Orpah, which is Ruth's sister-in-law who chooses to return to her family and God's in Moab when Naomi tells them to go back. Elimelech, which is Naomi's deceased husband, who moved the family to Moab due to famine. Mahlon and Chilion, which is Naomi's sons. Mahlon was Ruth's first husband. We have this closer relative known in the story as a certain fellow. He is the kinsman from a better legal right, with a better legal right to marry Ruth than Boaz, but he declines, which is a shameful act that is actually deeply frowned upon. Then, of course, we have the women of Bethlehem, local women who provide communal perspective, celebrating the restoration of Naomi's life. Like they knew her when they were younger and celebrated her coming back, but yet they weren't sure how they could help because, unfortunately, the law and society was against Naomi and Ruth during this time. So they were there to support, celebrate, and be with them through that. But interestingly enough, the key figures of this book don't just rely on the characters themselves, the people that we meet, but also on themes like loyalty and providence, redemption, and outsider status, which we have gone at length talking about those already. But those are just key figures that come in the form of themes for us. So then what we see next is our key teachings. And this is something that is really important because the Book of Ruth teaches that God's providence works through ordinary faithful actions to bring redemption from tragedy. But it's also the key teachings of God's providence is the power of steadfast loyalty, God's loving inclusion of all people. That's in this case the Gentiles, which plays out a bigger factor as the time goes, regardless of status, and Boaz as a type of Christ-like figure who brings about resurrection and renewal for the people who are hurting. And so what we see is, of course, faithfulness among tragedy. We see tragedy strike, but yet we see that God works through the people. God does not, God does not directly intervene, but God works through the people, which is something that we see more proactively done today. We see divine providence, so God's sovereignty. God works behind the scenes of everyday life. The concept of redemption, in which we see new hope and building up of that. Loyalty and kindness, the Hesed. Ruth shows profound impact of covenantal love with her mother-in-law and loyalty, which needs to be reflective of our own relationship with God. The inclusivity of all peoples. We see she's a Gentile, an outsider, someone who's actually deeply frowned and hated upon. We see God uses unexpected people. Ruth is an unexpected person, a poor foreign widow, whom God uses to bring about the great genealogy of King David and ultimately Jesus Christ. We see hard work and integrity. Ruth exhibits both of these with humility and work ethic. They show that it's important to give our all in everything we do. Then, of course, the sacrificial love. The book teaches that true love is willing to sacrifice personal gain for the good of others, exemplified by Ruth leaving her home for a new uncertain life. Sometimes we're called into directions that we don't always expect. So what that means for our takeaway verse is what Ruth says to her mother-in-law. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. I mean, she's giving up everything in order to show this and put this forward then. Our next setup then is what our conclusions are. So the book of Ruth ultimately reveals that God's sovereign grace redeems tragedy and loss. What it shows is transforming ordinary kindness and faithfulness into something bigger than what it is. We see loyalty, we see steadfast love, and we see a lineage that builds up and goes from here. So our core themes that we see that we can take away from this is, of course, redemption and providence, God's work in all things, the steadfast love, inclusiveness, kinsman redeemer, faithfulness, and love in life. And so we see a lot of this stuff playing out together, what we see from all this together. So, drawing all that stuff in our inclusion together, what does that mean for us today? Well, I'm looking at Clarence Francis's writing here, or quote here. It says, "You cannot buy loyalty. You cannot buy the devotion of hearts, minds, and souls. You have to earn these things." And we see that through our everyday actions of what we see. because some of the great lessons that we get from Ruth for us today is loyalty and selflessness. Ruth's dedication to Naomi models a committed relationship about putting or meeting people where they are. Faith during trials, knowing that even when we go through the hardships of life, we're not alone in this. We have God, we have one another, we have the Spirit, we have ways to get through the hardships in which we're never alone when we do that. Hard work and humility. I mean, Ruth was not afraid to do the hard stuff. She was not willing to put. She was willing to put herself out there to help meet people where they are and be with them through this entire time. A redeemer perspective. Boaz acts as that redeemer, which points directly to Jesus Christ. Ruth's story reminds us that our brokenness can be redeemed, providing hope when we feel like outcasts. And then, of course, that last, or one of the last ones that we can do is that God's providence in small steps. We don't need to see the whole plan. Sometimes we just have to take each step as it comes. It's like the one song from I was gonna say Baskin Robbins, but no, that's an ice cream place. But the old claymation cartoon of Santa Claus is coming down, where he's helping the Winter Wizard go forward because he's always was over reliant. The wizard was always overly reliant upon his magic, and so our Kris Kringle Santa then sings, "Put one foot in front of the other, and soon you'll be walking out the door." That's how we can live today in the way that we are loyal in tough situations. Take the next step, take one step at a time, and have our trust in God. That can be sometimes the hardest thing that we could ever do. So that's that then with this amazing book that we're looking at with Ruth. There's so much that goes on into it and such an impact to it. And so it's really important for us to be able to take that with us. So next time that we meet, which will be in 2 weeks, I thought I had a book that I could sit there and show with this, but no. But what we see in 2 weeks is that we're going to jump into Samuel. Samuel is broken into 2 parts, but we're going to take it all in one go. So this is going to be a really long video next time. But hopefully you'll bear with it and be with us through all that time. But I hope you have yourself a great time. I hope you've been enjoying this time tremendously as we go about this time of looking at Ruth. And I look forward to what we can go from here then. So you have yourself a good rest of the day, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.